Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all very much. I got a lot of good feedback over the break. I hope that the science was not overpowering, and I hope that it was at an appropriate level for doctors and patients and nutritionists and members of the community. I will try to do the same in this next talk as well. The most important thing is to debunk the myths that have surrounded this issue of chronic disease. As the obesity and metabolic syndrome, diabetes, heart disease epidemics have gotten worse, all we have heard in response is, you're non-compliant. If you're getting sick, it must be your own fault. And I am here to tell you that the reason that things are getting worse is not because you are not compliant. The reason is because the information that you were given was wrong in the first place. In order to do that, I have to debunk all of the myths. And I only have 45 minutes to do it, so you'll forgive me, we'll go relatively fast, but you will see why these are all myths. So this is from the New England Journal of Medicine, and what they're looking at is reversible heart disease and the factors that go into changes in heart disease. And what you can see is smoking, down. Blood pressure, down. Cholesterol, down. Physical activity, up. 4 separate things that should reap a health benefit. But we did not see that. We saw, if anything, a health deficit in the United States. And the reason was because obesity was up and diabetes was through the roof. A quadrupling of diabetes rates. This is what happens to health care. We're looking here now at hospital costs in red, physician costs in green, and pharma costs in purple. And they do not add up to the total health care costs, because the rest is going to, what happened there? I lost my slide. The rest of it's going to chronic metabolic disease, like diabetes. And not only does that take money off the negative side of the ledger in terms of healthcare costs and hospitalization, etc., it also takes money off the positive side of the ledger in terms of economic productivity for individuals and for companies. So this is a huge problem. Now, in America, you may have heard of this thing we have there called Obamacare. Just a little. You've heard about recent stuff, like yesterday. The question, of course, was how to pay for this. And President Obama told us that we could pay for putting 32 million sick people onto the insurance rolls in America by providing preventative services. That is, by being able to go see a doctor, we could keep people out of the emergency room, where the cost of the healthcare is 50 times as expensive. And so by keeping people out of the emergency room, we would pay for the problem. So this is what happened in America instead. The government can't make me buy health insurance, and why would I when I can just go here and you'll pay for it? This is America. Okay? But this is what happened instead. Post-Obamacare uptick in emergency room visits. Healthcare plans to increase an average of 25%. It did not work. The basis, the predication of Obamacare did not work. And the reason was because they were trying to fix healthcare. You can't fix healthcare until you fix health. We did not. We have not. We continue not to. And here's what's going on with Trump care. Have diabetes? Trump's budget director says you brought it on yourself, so no health care for you. This is how America plans on dealing with its healthcare crisis, is basically letting people die. That's the plan. Let people die. And as you probably heard, the Congressional Budget Office in America plan says that the new healthcare plan that the Senate is voting on will kick 23 million people off the insurance rolls. Those are the people that Obama put on. Basically, they're just going to undo, and people will have no health care. Again, this is what we have in America. Hopefully, Serbia a little bit better. The inconvenient truths of this issue. There is no medicalized prevention of chronic metabolic disease. There is only just long-term treatment. Treatment with statins, treatment with antihypertensive, treatment with insulin resistance drugs, etc., etc. Okay? Those make lots of money for the drug industry, but do not solve the problem. They may delay the problem, but they do not solve it. You cannot fix healthcare until you fix health. And you can't fix health until you fix diet. And there is nothing in Obamacare or Trumpcare for fixing diet. Period. Because everyone says, I should be able to eat whatever I want. That's a problem. Because as you've heard, some calories are different from others. So until you fix your diet, you can't fix your health. It's that simple. In the meantime, deaths from diabetes complications have declined, but the diabetes rates are going so high that it makes up for it, and the costs keep going up. In America, $245 billion spent on diabetes alone. $1.8 trillion on the diseases of metabolic syndrome. Type 2 diabetes in children has increased, and 1/3 of Americans will have diabetes by the year 2050. 1/3. Now, if you think we can afford that, even though we're America, you have another thing coming. It's not possible. We cannot afford it. And no country can afford it. In fact, Saudi Arabia now has 18% diabetes. They cannot afford it. Saudi Arabia cannot afford it. If they can't afford it, what about every other country? So in order to fix the problem, in order to fix health, we have to debunk the 5 myths that allow this to continue. And I will try to take each myth in turn. The first myth, chronic disease is genetic. Well, I have bad genetics. That's the reason. I actually do have bad genetics. I actually have familial hypercholesterolemia. And my father had his heart attack at 61. His father had his heart attack and died at 44. My mother's father had his first heart attack at 38, and had 4 heart attacks by the time he was 72. My sister has it as well. We actually do have bad genetics. Okay? But not everybody has bad genetics. So if you look at monogenic disorders, genetics are the common problem. But when you look at polygenic disorders, like metabolic syndrome, turns out most of it has to do with the environment rather than with genetics. And the question is, what about that environment? If you look at obesity, looking for genes that affect obesity, only one here, this one here, called FTO, has been shown to have any meaningful relation to obesity in humans. If you have this FTO gene, it adds about 5 kilos. So you would end up being 11 pounds greater because you had that gene. 11 pounds is not enough to cause obesity. Now, there are 36 separate genes that have been associated with obesity, and if you had every single one of those, it would only account for a total of 10 kilos, 20 pounds. If you had every single gene wrong, it would only be 22 pounds. We have a 50 to 100 pound problem. So genetics do not explain what is going on. How about metabolic syndrome? Same thing. Only 5 to 10% of the of metabolic syndrome can be explained by genetics. The rest of it is this other stuff, which of course is environment. There's no genetic factor that has been able to encompass the diseases of metabolic syndrome. And so it's much more appropriate to look at for the environmental contributors. So let's look at how genes and environment interact with each other to cause this problem. So this was work done at Harvard by Frank Hu's group. And what they did was they developed a genetic predisposition index. And if you have the worst genetics, and you drink sodas, then you're going to increase your BMI the most. But as you can see, the people who don't have so much genetics don't increase their BMI very much. So yes, there are some genetic predispositions that mean sugar will drive more weight gain. That's true, but most people don't have it. If you look for liver disease, Latinos in America have a defect in this gene called PNPLA3, and 19% of Latinos have this gene problem, GG, right here, rather than the other two genetic variations, CC or CG. If you have the GG, which is over here, a little sugar makes a lot of liver fat. And since I told you liver fat is the thing that causes the chronic disease, these people who have this GG phenotype really have to stay away from sugar. The rest of them, no correlation. So, again, there are certain genes that do put you at predisposition, but it is always the environment that causes that predisposition to come out. And if you fix the environment, the genes don't matter. It's about the environment. Same thing for this gene. It's called SLC16A11. If you have this, you do make a little bit more triglyceride, you do make a little bit more liver fat. Okay, and it's over here, as you can see, triacylglycerols are higher, but only in response to problems with the diet. So again, genes are not the issue, the environment is the issue. Myth number 2, surrogate markers that we measure in the blood will predict risk for disease. Everyone says, well, my hemoglobin A1C is 5.2, so I have no problem. Or my hemoglobin A1C is 8, I've got to get it down. The question is, are those things true? Does hemoglobin A1C answer the question? How about LDL? Everyone's worried about their LDL, their low-density lipoprotein. Let's start with LDL. So LDL does correlate with cardiovascular disease, but not all that much. I mean, when you look at it, it's only about a 1.3-fold increase, a 30% increase. The public health officials say that that's like the least amount that matters. Okay? So it's not a huge correlation. And there's a reason why LDL is not the real problem, and I will show you as we go. If LDL were the problem, and we know that dietary fat raises LDL, that is true. I won't argue that. Dietary fat raises LDL. Then a low-fat diet should predict a lower LDL and therefore a reduced risk of heart disease. But it doesn't. This is from the women's study, and it showed that there was essentially no effect of a low-fat diet on improving heart disease. In fact, the low-fat diet only increased obesity in this study. There was no benefit of being on a low-fat diet. Yet, for the last 40 years, we have been told that we need to be on a low-fat diet in order to reduce our LDL, in order to reduce our risk for heart disease. It doesn't work. In fact, my colleague Asim Malhotra in London, and this group of very distinguished physicians, showed that if you actually take people who have a genetic risk, and they all develop their problems before age 60. So if you only look at the people who don't have genetic risk, 60 to 95, ages 60 to 95, turns out that LDL correlates with longevity. The higher your LDL, once you're out of the genetic risk group, the higher your LDL, the longer you live. So, does a high LDL mean you have a problem? Not necessarily. But yet everyone is saying, we got to get your LDL down, we got to get your LDL down. The question is, why all of this effort on LDL when, in fact, the data do not support it? So, randomized controlled trials of either drug or dietary interventions, 44 total randomized controlled trials, showed no beneficial effect on mortality, none, and virtually no effect on cardiovascular events, and actually some of the drug studies reported harm, particularly the statin. trials. 20% rhabdomyolysis. Statins may not be a panacea. In fact, if you look at the effect of statins, it's virtually right on the identity line in terms of morbidity and mortality. This one's mortality, and this one's morbidity due to heart disease. Again, essentially, no effect. Why? Why is this? The reason this happens is because there are different types of lipids. So this is chylomicrons. This is what happens when you eat dietary fat. This is the first thing that's made. This goes straight to the liver. The liver then takes the lipid out of these and turns it into LDL. Okay? Now it turns out there's not one LDL, there are two. Everybody knows about HDL. That's the good cholesterol. That's the one you want to be high. And that's actually because of what happens peripherally. You scavenge the lipid off it and you turn it into HDL. So LDL gets turned into HDL, which is a good thing. Turns out it's not about LDL cholesterol, it's about LDL particle number. LDL particle number, LDL-P, rather than LDL-C. But we only measure LDL-C. We don't measure LDL-P. And the reason is because to measure LDL-P, it's more complicated. And it requires a different set of tests, and it's more expensive. So none of the lipid measuring labs do this. But it turns out that LDL-P, if it's low, it doesn't matter if the cholesterol is high or low. You have a better chance of event-free survival. Whereas if your LDL-P is high, it doesn't matter if your LDL cholesterol is high or low. You have a much less chance of event-free survival. So it's the particle number that matters, not the LDL cholesterol. And the question is, how do you determine which you have? If it's not the cholesterol, it's the particle number. How do you figure that out? And the answer is, you have to know what else is going on in your blood. So here's the conundrum. This is called large buoyant LDL, or pattern A. This is called small dense LDL, or pattern B. They both get measured in the LDL fraction. But there are two of them. And they're very different, as you can see. And they confer different risks. This stuff is basically neutral. It floats. It's large and it's buoyant. It floats and it's too big to get under the surface of the epithelial cells in the vasculature to start the plaque formation process. These, for all intents and purposes, are neutral. And this is what dietary fat raises. This is why dietary fat is not the demon that it was made out to be. Yes, dietary fat raises LDL. It raises this LDL. Who cares? This guy, small, dense. It sinks. It's dense. It's small. It gets under the surface of the epithelial cell and vasculature to start the plaque formation process. And what drives this? Carbohydrate. So carbohydrate, by inducing insulin resistance, causes this LDL. And that's the bad guy. But this is only 20% of this. So when you measure LDL, you're really measuring mostly this. Who cares? Again, LDL is not the issue. What is the issue? Well, it turns out triglycerides are actually a better marker for heart disease than LDL ever was. Okay, and you can see here, much higher. Remember, it was 30% for LDL? Okay, it's closer to 80% for the triglycerides. But triglycerides have been ignored. And the reason is because triglycerides are much more, shall we say, responsive to diet. So a lot of people don't come fasting. And so the triglycerides are high because they didn't come fasting. So people didn't look at it because you have to be fasted. And so they didn't do the studies. But it turns out fasting triglyceride is a much better marker of risk for heart disease than LDL ever was. So how do you figure out what's going on? How do you figure out if you have the pattern B or the pattern A? And the answer is you look at the triglyceride and you look at the HDL. If you have pattern A, which is the large buoyant like this, what you see is that you have low triglycerides, high HDL. And if you have low triglycerides, high HDL, your LDL level is irrelevant because you have pattern A. However, if you have high triglycerides, low HDL, then you have the small dense LDL, in which case you have hepatitis B. And that's the thing to be worried about. The question is, which do you have? Do you know? Have you looked? Did your doctor interpret it this way? Or did they just read a number off a panel and say, oh, you're within the reference range, you're fine? Doctors don't necessarily know this. Cardiologists should know this. Lipidologists definitely know this. But not every doctor knows this. We're trying to, educate, and that's why I'm here, is to do this. So, insulin resistance determines how the lipids are packaged. So if everything's going okay, you have a low triglyceride pool, but when things are not okay, you have lots of free fatty acids coming in, and you will end up with a high triglyceride pool, which will make VLDL, which is measured in the triglyceride fraction. So triglycerides mean insulin resistance. And that leads to the atherogenic small LDL. Okay? And that is what causes the increase in the size of the intimate that drives heart disease. Okay? I'm going to pass this for just too much time. Okay, but all I can tell you is when we took the sugar out of these kids' diets for the 9 days, what we saw was that the VLDL went way down, went down 46%. The LDL went down 10%. And the small dense LDL, the bad guy, disappeared. And the reason is because they stopped being insulin resistant. We fixed it without even fixing calories, just by getting rid of the sugar. Okay? So now, myth number 2B, hemoglobin A1C. Everyone says, oh, I got to get my hemoglobin A1C down. Is that true or not true? Does this predict risk? So it turns out, if you look at the studies that have been done, lowering hemoglobin A1C doesn't reduce coronary events. It reduces nephropathy, kidney disease, retinopathy, eye disease, neuropathy, leg disease, and nerve disease. It definitely decreases that. But you know what? You die of a heart attack anyway. You die with your arteries, with your small arteries okay, but your big arteries are just as fried as they were before. And there are 5 studies that show this. I'm going to show you the data from 2 of them. So here's all-cause mortality in the UK PBS study. This was the United Kingdom Prospective Diabetes Study. And showing placebo and showing tolbutamide, basically trying to get the hemoglobin A1C down. And you can see all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality highest in the group that got the medicine to lower their hemoglobin A1C. In this study, this was rosiglitazone, one of the thiazolidinediones. This was a big deal in the New England Journal of Medicine about 10 years ago. And what they showed was that if you were on this medicine, which lowered your hemoglobin A1C, your odds-risk ratio for heart attack went up 43%, and cardiovascular death 64%. And they actually put a black box on rosiglitazone after that because of the increase in deaths. Helped diabetes, brought hemoglobin A1C down, caused more heart disease. This is the ACCORD trial, which had to be stopped because here's standard therapy, here's intensive therapy. Notice, they're getting the hemoglobin A1C down very nicely by giving more insulin. But now take a look at the mortality. It actually went up. People died of heart disease with their hemoglobin A1C better. So is hemoglobin A1C what you should be looking at as a marker for your diabetes care? Not necessarily. It's a great marker for small vessel disease. It is a crappy marker for big vessel disease. So if your doctor, if you have diabetes and your doctor says, we've got to get your hemoglobin A1C down, I would say, no, what you need to do is you need to get your insulin down. Because if you get your insulin down, that means you're insulin sensitive. And if you're insulin sensitive, that means you can come off your medicine, in which case you won't get small vessel disease or large vessel disease. Okay? And this just shows the same thing. Intensive control, more deaths. Accord, more deaths. Because the metabolic dysfunction is still there. You haven't fixed the metabolic syndrome itself. You haven't fixed the cause. You're fixing the result. The horse is out of the barn. That's not the problem. That's a marker of the problem. Fixing the marker of the problem is irrelevant. Fixing the problem is what you have to do. And until you fix the problem, don't expect anything good to happen. Here's why this happens. So here's insulin binding to its receptor. And you'll notice it activates this cascade in the liver. All of these things in blue are good. They're all the metabolic effects of insulin. And they drive glucose down, they increase protein synthesis, they increase glycogen synthesis, all good. Everything it does in blue is good. The problem is there's also a second pathway in red. And everything this pathway does is bad. It causes vascular smooth muscle proliferation, it causes cancer, it causes cells to divide. And the more cells divide, the more chance you are to die. That's one of the reasons why insulin is both good and bad. It's always good and bad. It's good today and it's bad tomorrow. Short-term gain for long-term pain. Yes, it's necessary to get your blood glucose down, but in the process, you are increasing your risk for long-term complications, okay? Because of this red pathway. And you can't dissociate the two. So every time you activate the blue pathway, you're also activating the red pathway. Good and bad. Insulin's always good and bad. It's never good or bad, it's good and bad. Everybody understand this concept? So, do not let your doctor say that hemoglobin A1C is all that matters. Your insulin sensitivity is what matters. Myth number 3. It's about obesity. Now, we covered that in the first talk. And it's not about obesity, it's about diabetes, it's about chronic metabolic disease. Because there are fat, healthy people, right? Metabolically healthy obese, and there are thin, sick people who have metabolic syndrome, even though they don't have increased weight. Because obesity is not the problem. People do not die of obesity. In America, they don't even put obesity on the death certificate. They put all the diseases of metabolic syndrome on the death certificate. And here they are. That's what they put on the death certificate. In fact, if you look at all of the medicines given to all of the patients in the United States within this one particular group called Optum, okay, you'll notice a lot of people who are obese got a lot of medicine. But you'll notice a lot of people with normal BMI also got a lot of medicine because they also have diabetes. And a lot of young people who are also normal weight also got a lot of medicine. Everybody see that? It's not just about obesity. It's about the metabolic dysfunction that anyone can get. Because obesity is a result of the metabolic dysfunction, not the cause. Myth number 4, and we covered this earlier, a calorie is a calorie. That's their myth. And they made this myth very specific because that way they can justify putting anything in any food they want. Because if you eat too many calories, whose fault is that? Not theirs. Okay? This is a ploy to escape culpability. Well, let's look at this. So back in the 1970s, there was a war going on between the fat is a problem people and the sugar is a problem people. Okay? And there were two major protagonists, major leaders of the two camps. This guy here, John Yudkin. Anybody ever heard of him? He's a British physiologist, nutritionist, physician, who in the 1950s found correlation between sugar consumption and heart disease. And he wrote this book in 1972 called Pure, White, and Deadly. It did very well, but the food industry went berserk, absolutely berserk. And they said, this guy needs to be taken down. On the other side, We had this guy over here named Ansel Keys. Anybody ever heard of him? Yes? Couple? Okay. He was the inventor of the K ration in America, okay, which is 12,000 calories in a little tin box that soldiers could carry into war, World War II, in order to stay alive behind enemy lines. So he was kind of famous in America already. And he was the one that said saturated fat was the cause of heart disease. And these two were at each other's throats. They duked it out. And the question is, who won and why? So, 7-country study. We're going to look at that. Here are his 7 countries. Calories from fat on the x-axis. Coronary disease deaths on the y-axis. And here are the 7 countries. The U.S., Canada, Australia, England and Wales, Italy, Japan. And you look at this and you say, looks pretty good. There's clearly a correlation here between saturated fat and coronary disease. Keys must be right, except for one small problem. It wasn't the 7-country study. It was a 22-country study. So here are the other 15 countries now plotted as well. What do you see? Well, there's still a minor correlation, but it's not nearly as good. It's not nearly as tight as it was before. These were cherry-picked. 7 countries were cherry-picked out of the 22 to make his point. That's not the way you do data. And he left the outliers out. The Maasai, the Inuit, the Rendili, the Tokolala, indigenous tribes that don't have carbohydrate in their diet. They eat meat and milk and blood, no carbohydrate. The Inuit, they had ice. They didn't have any place to grow a carbohydrate. They ate whale blubber, but they still had a serum glucose level because the liver would take the fat and turn it into glucose, called gluconeogenesis. So the food industry says, you need sugar to live. No, you need a blood sugar to live. You don't need dietary sugar to live. You don't need dietary carbohydrate to live. People who are on ketogenic diets, I'm not espousing them, I'm not saying you should be on one, but they do fine. They do fine, and the reason is because their liver will take the fat and turn it into glucose. Because you need a blood sugar to live, but you don't need to consume it to live. These guys don't consume any carbohydrate, and they have the lowest heart disease on the planet. He left those out. Why did he leave those out? Why do you think? So this is from page 262 of the 500-country study. It's a 500-page book. And here's what he said. The fact that the incidence rate of coronary heart disease was significantly correlated with the average percentage of calories from sucrose, sugar, in the diets is explained by the intercorrelation of sucrose with saturated fat. Intercorrelation of sucrose with saturated fat. Convergence of the two, sucrose and saturated fat. In other words, donuts. Donuts. These guys eat donuts. These guys don't eat donuts. Partial correlation analysis shows that with saturated fat constant, there was no significant correlation between dietary sucrose and the incidence of coronary heart disease. That's what he said. And those are Keys' own words. When you do a multivariate linear regression analysis, you have to do it both ways. Like we did before with the visceral and the liver fat, you hold one constant and show that one doesn't work, and then you switch it and you hold the other one constant and show that the other one still works. That's how you do a multivariate linear regression analysis. He did a partial regression analysis. He didn't do the whole thing. Why not? Why didn't he do the whole thing? Because it didn't work, that's why. Didn't make his point, that's why. He left out the 15 countries that would shoot his theory down. In other words, it was a lie. The fat hypothesis was a lie. The cholesterol hypothesis was a lie. And the Sugar Association paid off the Harvard School of Public Health to make it the lie, to exonerate their product. you've all been living a lie for the last 40 years. I hope you feel somewhat violated, because you should. But this started the low-fat craze, and it's still going on with us today. Because the content of low-fat home food can be controlled. You can determine what you put in your own food. But low-fat processed food means substitution with carbohydrate, because low-fat processed food tastes terrible. They have to do something to make it worth eating. Well, you add carbohydrate. Well, which carbohydrate? Well, particularly sugar. Here are, in America, snack wells. They're still with us. We still have those. Well, here's the recipe. 2 grams of fat down, 13 grams of carbohydrate up, 4 bunch of sugars. So which was better for you? The original cookie or the snack well? Here's a carton of milk. My daughter, when she was in 2nd grade, she's now going to college, brought this home to me. Said, "Dad, you're not going to believe what they serve us in the cafeteria." So this is Berkeley Farms low-fat milk, 1%. Notice, 130 calories, 15 grams of sugar, all lactose, milk sugar, not a problem. And here's Berkeley Farms 1% chocolate milk. 190 calories, 29 grams of sugar, all high fructose corn syrup. So when you're drinking chocolate milk, you're drinking a glass of milk plus a glass of orange juice. Is that good? Not so good. Well, in fact, the fat hypothesis has been debunked. And the first people to do it were the Nutrition Committee of the American Heart Association. Yet, despite that, the American Heart Association is still telling people to eat low-fat meats, which I think is very humorous. Okay? This is very interesting. This is Credit Suisse, okay? International Investment Bank. And they publish research reports for their investors. And they came out with one called FAT, the New Health Paradigm, last year. And here's what it says. And I completely agree with this. A high intake of omega-6 vegetable oils has not been proven to be as beneficial for our health, and trans fats have been shown to have negative health effects. The higher intake of vegetable oils and the increase in carbohydrate consumption in the last 30 to 40 years are the 2 leading factors behind the high rates of obesity and metabolic syndrome in the U.S. Saturated and monounsaturated fats are not. An international investment bank, looking at the data with a clear eye, came up with the right answer. The doctors have not. How can that be? How can that be? Because we are, unfortunately, subject to mythology and dogma ourselves. In fact, processed food is the problem. Because processed food has 3 things too little and 8 things too much. Too little fiber, we talked about in the first talk, about the reduction in absorption so your liver stays healthy. Too few omega-3 fatty acids, which you get from wild fish. Too few micronutrients, which go with the fiber fraction, like thiamine, is in the husk of the rice. When you polish the rice, you get berry. And then finally, too much trans fats, but we know that, and they're coming down. Too many branched chain amino acids, we talked about that in the first talk. Too many omega-6 fatty acids, they are pro-inflammatory. They're what are in seed oils. Too many food additives, red dye, food dye, yellow, this, that. Emulsifiers, they're my favorite. They're what help fat and water stay together. So when you put the lasagna in the microwave, it doesn't separate out, it stays lasagna. Okay? Well, emulsifiers are detergents. It's also what you put in your washing machine to get the stains out, because it lets fat and water mix. So what happens if you swallow a detergent? What happens? There's a mucin layer on the surface of your epithelial cells to protect them. It gets eaten away. And then the bacteria can attach. And that may be some of the cause of inflammatory bowel disease and possibly autoimmune disease and possibly food allergy. Not so good. Emulsifiers. And where is the highest concentration of emulsifiers? Ice cream. Because you have to keep fat and water together. And who brought emulsifiers to ice cream? Margaret Thatcher. Seriously. She was an ice cream chemist before she was a member of parliament. She really was the Iron Lady. Too much salt, right? Salt, raised blood pressure. Too many nitrates, cured meat, processed, bacon, sausage, causes nitrosoureas, increases risk for colon cancer. And finally, the one that blows everything else out of the water, too much sugar. So, a calorie is not a calorie because if it comes along in processed food, it's a particularly egregious and toxic. And finally, myth number 5, we're almost at the end. It's about personal responsibility. No one put that donut in your mouth. You have choice over what you eat. In America, people think this is a God-given right, that it's in the Constitution. It's not in the Constitution. Who invented personal responsibility? Anybody? You know who invented personal responsibility? It's the tobacco industry. Because they had to think of another reason to keep you smoking. Okay? No one put that cigarette in your mouth. You lit it yourself. You chose to smoke. Personal responsibility. And that worked for 35 years. Well, in order to invoke personal responsibility, you have to satisfy 4 caveats. First is knowledge. You have to have the knowledge of what you're doing. Because if you don't have the knowledge, how can you exercise personal responsibility? Well, it turns out there are 56 names for sugar. And you don't know them. And they're on the back of the package, but if you didn't know they were sugar, how could you respond? How could you know what you're eating? Turns out, you can have a different sugar as number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9. And when you add them up, it turns out to be number 1. And that's on purpose, because the food industry tries to hide it. In America, I'm sure it's true here too, here's our nutrition facts label. And here's total sugars, and you'll notice there's no daily value. There's no percent daily value. Because they don't want you to know how much is too much. That's on purpose. And they make stuff up. So this is called financial conflicts of interest and reporting bias, looking at sugar-sweetened beverages and weight gain. So 18 data points, 18 studies, 6 funded by the food industry, 12 independently funded. Of the 6 funded by the food industry, 5 said no effect of sugar on weight gain. 5. Of the 12 that were independent, 10 said yes, sugar associated with weight gain. Highly significant. This is from the food industry. Okay, this is Richard Cottrell. He's the head of the Sugar Research Organization. 25 studies met inclusion criteria that varied in quality and duration. And you'll notice, impossible to draw reliable conclusions except with regard to substitution of sucrose for starch, where the effects of plasma lipids were inconsistent, mostly explicable by other factors or non-significant. Okay? He said it himself, varying quality and duration. Yet, when we looked at it, this is from my colleague Dean Schillinger at UCSF, okay? Looking at the same question, positive versus negative association. If the food company sponsored the study, no effect. If the study was done by an independent scientist, 33 positive, 1 negative. Do you think that the food industry might be the reason why the data were inconsistent and of poor quality? On purpose, because they want to dilute the literature so that you can't know the answer. And if a food industry concern published the paper, it is 7.61 times more likely to be positive toward their product. Duh. Is anyone surprised? And of course, the paper I showed you earlier, that we have the smoking gun, where we show that the Sugar Research Foundation paid the scientists to produce the papers that exonerated their product. A huge, big, fat lie. A big fat lie and a big fat lie. Fat in both ways. when they were confronted with this lie, here's what they said. We acknowledge that the Sugar Research Foundation should have exercised greater transparency in all of its research activities. However, when the studies in question were published, funding disclosures and transparency standards were not the norm they are today. Generally speaking, it is not only unfortunate, but a disservice that industry-funded research is branded as tainted. Most concerning is the growing use of headline-baiting articles to trump quality scientific research. We're disappointed to see a journal of JAMA's stature being drawn into this trend. In other words, they're blaming us. The food industry is blaming us. I got a real problem with that. Access. You have to have access. If you don't have access to healthy food, how can you exercise personal responsibility? Affordability. If you can't afford the right choice, the healthy choice, how can that be personal responsibility? What about poor people? They get food stamps. Food stamps doesn't even have fruit on it. It has fruit juice, but not fruit. How can they exercise personal responsibility? And finally, your choice can't hurt anyone else. Because if your choice hurts someone else, that's called anarchy. This paper came out in Lancet last year called Profits, not last year, sorry, a couple of years ago, Profits and Pandemics. And what they say is that when I went to medical school, I learned the old medicine. And the problem was infections, and the vector was microbes. But today you have to learn the new medicine, where the problem is chronic disease and the vector is multinational corporations. And just like bacteria, multinational corporations learn resistance. They learn how to get around targeted efforts to try to reduce their impact on disease. So at UCSF, we are a health sciences university. We have to model for the public. We introduced last year the UCSF Healthy Beverage Initiative. If you come to our campus, you cannot find a sugar beverage. It doesn't exist. Any caterers who bring food on campus know that they cannot bring sugar beverages on campus. People come to our cafeteria and say, where are the sodas? We say, they're bad for you. So that they get the idea. Oh, where was the first place that banned smoking? Hospitals. For the same reason. Because doctors have to model correct behavior for their patients. Proposal number 2. Let's rename type 2 diabetes what it is. Let's call it processed food disease. You think you would learn something from that? You have processed food disease. That might make a little bit more of an impact on what's going on and what you need to do about it than calling it type 2 diabetes. The word diabetes is Egyptian. Nobody knows what it means. It means siphon, because you're in the bathroom urinating all day. Okay? No one knows that. Let's call it what it is. And educate the public while we're diagnosing. Proposal number 3. Let's get rid of all the subsidies for processed food. No economist believes in subsidizing food because it distorts the market. Let the market do what it will. And if it does, it actually means that food prices would not change except for sugar. It's the only thing that will go up, which is a good thing. Number 4, I mentioned our nonprofit, Real Certified. If you see a green fork, not in Europe yet, we're only in America, but if you see a green fork in the window, that means whatever they serve in this restaurant can't kill you. And finally, proposal number 5, remove sugar from the generally recognized as safe list, like we did with trans fats, because it's not generally recognized as safe. Not anymore. Now we know what the real story is. And now you have to realize that sugar is not a food. It's a food additive. And it should be treated as such. And there should be limits on its addition to processed food. Finally, this is a famous author in America. He wrote a book called The Jungle. His name is Upton Sinclair. And it started the Food and Drug Administration in 1906 because he described the meatpacking industry and all the problems. And this is a direct quote from him. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. This is true all over the world. If your money comes from a company, you're going to say something different about that company. And doctors and scientists, when they take money, they say something different. I do not take money. I have only one interest, the health of children. That's mine. And I'll be happy to take any questions about these 5 myths. You have the microphone?
I'm not sure whether my question is directly related to these 5 myths. I wanted to ask you a question because lately several of my female friends in their 30s were diagnosed with insulin sensitivity. I'm not sure whether that is a proper medical term. They have normal blood sugar, but when they do the test for glucose, it spikes up, it doesn't recover. Some of them were put on meds, they had to correct their diet, but then some of them had really conflicting opinions by endocrinologists.
Yes.
Because some of them were saying you have insulin resistance based on the blood test, and the others were saying no, you don't have any other symptoms, this is not insulin insensitivity. So my question is, do you have any comments based on which symptoms should be diagnosed and should be treated with meds or with correction of diets?
Insulin resistance can be completely silent. Just like fatty liver disease can be completely silent. Okay? It's like hypertension. Okay? So if you have a blood pressure of 130/80, but you have no symptoms, you don't get headaches. Do you have a problem or not? 130/80. Do you have a problem or not? Oh yes, you do. Oh yes, you do. Eventually. Because every rise per millimeter of blood pressure increases your risk for stroke by 2%. Long term. Now, it may not cause you a problem today, but it very well may cause you a problem tomorrow. So the question is it okay? And the answer is, it's not okay. We need to be insulin sensitive. That's the way we're supposed to be. The question is, what caused the insulin sensitivity? The fact that you have no symptoms just means you're not far enough into it. But by the time you get far enough into it, you'll be very sick. And you should do something about it now. That's the way I look at it. Preventative medicine. Please. Can we get a microphone?
Is sugar related to vasculitis?
Is sugar related to what?
Vasculitis.
Vasculitis.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Vasculitis is, for the most part, an autoimmune phenomenon. The question is, does sugar predispose to autoimmune disease? And the answer is, we don't know. I wish we knew. I have many anecdotes of people who have emailed me telling me that when they went off sugar, their autoimmune disease got better. However, no scientific study has been performed, so I am not able to answer that question for you. There are reasons to suspect that it might have something to do with autoimmune disease. And there's even a potential mechanism and plausibility argument to be made. However, we do not have empiric data. No one has done that study where you take people with autoimmune disease and randomize their diets and see if getting the sugar out of their diet affects their autoimmune disease. I wish I could do that study. That has to be done in an adult population, and I only take care of children, so I can't do it. But I would love that study to be done. So I don't know the answer. Let me get a microphone.
You were talking about sugar, but what about artificial sweeteners? And maybe if you can mention something more about stevia and erythritol.
Right. Everybody wants to know about diet sweeteners. Me too. I want to know about diet sweeteners too. We don't have the data. We do not have the data. Why don't we have the data? You would think we would have the data. They've been around for a long time. Why hasn't anybody done the studies? Here's why. There's something called pharmacokinetics, PK. There's something called pharmacodynamics, PD. PK, PD, not the same. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, demands all of the pharmacokinetics before they will let the diet sweetener on the market. PK, pharmacokinetics, tells you about acute toxicity, keel over and die. Pharmacodynamics tells you about chronic toxicity, what happens to you long term. The FDA does not ask for that. It's not in their charter. So, PK we have for all the diet sweeteners. PD we have none because the FDA doesn't ask for it, so the food industry says, well, it's not going to help us market the product, can't help our sales, we're not going to do it. And then the National Institute of Health says, food industry's compound, food industry's profit, we're not going to pay for it. So we have an FDA who doesn't ask for it, we have a food industry who won't do it, and we have an NIH who won't pay for it. No data. Second problem. That's first problem number one. Second problem. You put something sweet on the tongue. What happens? Message goes tongue to brain. Sugar's coming. Message goes brain to pancreas. Sugar's coming. Get ready to release the insulin through the vagus nerve. But then the sugar never comes because it was a diet sweetener. What does the pancreas do? Does it go, oh man, I was waiting for all that sugar. Guess I'll just wait till tomorrow? Or does it go, no, I got all these insulin vesicles here stored up, ready to explode. I'm going to go find me some calories to work on. And you end up overeating. Which is it? There's some early data. We don't know this for sure yet. We only know on a one-day basis. We really need a 6-month basis to answer the question. But at least on the one-day basis, it looks like it's the second. That the diet sweetener may not cause the release of insulin because of the diet sweetener, but for everything else you ate, it will actually increase the amount of insulin, and so the total amount of insulin might actually go up. And if that were the case long term, that could account for diet sweeteners causing more weight gain and more metabolic syndrome. But we don't know that yet. Okay? The point is, the jury is still out on this question. We do not have the data. And then there's even a third problem, because a group in Israel showed that sucralose in an animal study actually caused leaky gut and caused glucose intolerance, and possibly, leading to autoimmune problems as well, just from the chemical itself. Whether that's true in humans or not, we do not know. That study has to be done. So we have many reasons to be concerned about diet sweeteners. But today, July 1st, 2017, I cannot give you an answer.
Even for stevia?
Even for stevia.
Okay.
It's the same thing for stevia.
You very clearly mentioned that the LDL could not be a predictor for cardiovascular diseases. According to the European Cardiology Association and American Heart Association, LDL is still official predictor.
Yes, I'm aware.
You know that we could not routinely do homocysteine and we do not routinely do ultrasensitive CRP.
Yeah.
What markers you will advise
Right.
for the estimation of the cardiovascular diseases?
Right. Absolutely. Great question. And you're absolutely correct that the American Heart Association still uses LDL as its primary marker for heart disease risk. I know that. The point is, it's not the LDL level that matters, it's the pattern of the lipids, as you can see, because the triglyceride matters also. And when you only look at LDL, you're missing the primary driver of the heart disease, which is the triglyceride, not the LDL. So, how do you figure it out? So, if you have high LDL and low triglyceride, you're probably fine. If you have high LDL and high triglyceride, you are probably not fine. And that's a big issue. Some other things that you can do to help answer the question is look at not just the triglyceride, but the Lp(a). So that's a huge risk factor for some people. It's genetic, so it matters, and that's something that's not routinely done. Another thing you can do is look at what happens to postprandial triglyceride. So we always do fasting triglyceride, but look at how high the triglyceride goes in response to, say, a milkshake, and see if it, just goes sky high. And that would also tell you that the liver is processing triglyceride very poorly. So with a low fasting triglyceride, if it makes it rise really high, and especially if you see lipemic serum, then that's very worrisome. But it's not the LDL level, it's the pattern of the LDL level in comparison to the triglyceride and to the HDL. And the other thing is, you have to look at the HDL. If the HDL is above 60, I would not worry about the LDL at all. Because the HDL is from the LDL. So what that means is that the LDL is offloading its lipid and turning it into HDL, which is protected, which means that your scavenger system at the periphery is excellent. It's working great. So again, there are things that you can look at in the lipid profile that will mitigate the concern about LDL. So just looking at the level alone is missing the point. You have to look at it in the pattern of everything else.
Sugar and asthma.
Don't know. I wish I knew. I have heard from some people that their asthma got better when their sugar consumption went down. But an N of 1 is not science. And I am only about science. I cannot answer the question. Okay? All of these issues regarding sugar and inflammatory conditions is a very important question, and I want to know the answer, but no one's done the studies yet. So I cannot, and I'm all about the science. I do not stick my neck out because the food industry would like nothing better than to cut it off. Okay? I have to stick within the science. I have shown you the science today.
What do you think about combination honey and oatmeal?
Honey and oatmeal?
Because you have dietary fibers in them,
Right.
and you postpone.
Right. Oatmeal is good, and if you have to add a little honey to down your oatmeal, it's okay. Just make it a little bit. You don't need a lot. A little sweet is okay. Doesn't have to be a lot sweet.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm for dessert, just for dessert. Not for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks. Yes. Yep. Please.
Ja bih vam postavila samo jedno pitanje.
Sure.
S obzirom da ste spomenuli decu, a i ja između ostalo kao nutricionista, često puta u ordinaciji od roditelja dobivam pitanje a koliko kockica šećera, odnosno koliko šećera moje dete može da unese.
Okay, that I can answer. Okay, so the American Heart Association just came out 2 months ago with its recommendation on sugar consumption for under 2 years of age. 0. 0. None under 2 years of age. 0. Now, if you feed your kid baby food, your kid likes it. Why does your kid like baby food? Because it's loaded with sugar. How many times do you have to introduce a savory food to an infant before they will accept it? 13. Median of 13. How many times do you have to introduce a sweet food to an infant before they will accept it? Once. 13, 1. There's a reason. Because everyone likes sugar. It's actually inscribed into our DNA to like sugar. And the reason we think, obviously, this is plausibility, evolutionary plausibility, but no one knows for sure, is that on the planet today, there are no foods that are sweet and acutely poisonous. So sweet was a message from nature that any given foodstuff to our ancestors was safe to eat. Think about ackee fruit, Jamaican ackee fruit. The immature fruit has a compound in it called hypoglycin. And this compound, if you consume it, it works on your liver, makes your blood glucose go down to 5 or 0. You vomit, you seize, and you can die. I've seen one case. It's called Jamaican vomiting sickness. But if you wait till the ackee fruit blooms or falls to the ground, then it's the Jamaican national dish, and they put it in tins and ship it all over the world. In the process of the ackee fruit maturing, that hypoglycin is metabolized away. So the Jamaicans know, don't eat the immature ackee fruit. Point is, sweet conferred immediate safety to our ancestors. We think that's the reason why kids immediately gravitate toward sugared foodstuffs if offered. Problem is, the food industry knows that. They want you to buy their product. And if you have to try to give your kid, peas, strained peas, 13 times before they will accept it, you might stop before you get to 13. They know that. So if they add a little sugar in it, the kid wolfs it down. Oh, my kid likes this. And the point is, now you're off to the races. The kid's going to be looking for sugar everywhere. American Heart Association says sugar threshold for 2 years and under is 0. For over 2 years to 10 years, 3 teaspoons of added sugar per day maximum. 3 teaspoons. Okay? Once you get to 12 years old, they're up to 4 teaspoons. And then finally, for adults, it's 6 teaspoons for women, 9 teaspoons for men. Right now in America, we are at 19 and a half average. We're supposed to be at 6 to 9. We are at 19 and a half. The UK is at 18. I'm not sure what Serbia is, unfortunately. The World Health Organization came out and said 12. The USDA in America said 12. That's at least close to 6 to 9. But the food industry lobbied them heavily to get them to raise that number. So hopefully that gives you some idea about where we should be and where we are. We need to ratchet this down significantly in order to get these diseases under control, in order to improve health. Until we do, we will not solve the problem. Microphone? Sorry.
Mogu da pitam nešto? Nego što treba mikrofon.
Oh. Good.
Da li da vas pitam nešto? Ako vam dođe pacijent sa krvnom slikom da je šećer u redu, trigliceridi u redu, LDL holesterol povećan, imate oftalmološki nalaze na pregled očnog, nakrvni sudovi su u redu, ultrazvuk rađen dijetra nije masna. Da li može da se smatra da taj pacijent nije kardiovaskularno ugrožen?
All right, well, wait a second. You just said 2 things that are dichotomous. You said the cholesterol is high, but the LDL is okay.
Trigliceridi su dobri, ali je loš holesterol povećan.
Okay, all right. So, remember we talked about the diseases being genetic? So, there is a disease, I have it, called familial hypercholesterolemia, FH. In this disease, you have a defect in the LDL receptor. And because you have a defect in the LDL receptor, you cannot recycle LDL at the liver. So LDL levels are super high. Triglycerides are normal. LDL is super high. If you have one bad gene, you get a heart attack when you're 40 or 50. If you have 2 bad genes, you get a heart attack when you're 18. So this is the disease that statins were invented for. And if you are not on a low-fat diet and a statin, you're going to get a heart attack because of your genetic predisposition. So, if you have FH, you need to be diagnosed as having FH. and then you need to be on a diet and a drug that is consistent with that. The problem is that most people do not have FH, because FH is only 1 in 500. Yet, 250 to 300 people out of 500 have lipid problems. More than half the population. They do not have FH. They have what is known as FCH, familial combined hyperlipidemia. They have high cholesterol, not super high, but high, and high LDL. And they also have high triglyceride. Those are the people who need to get rid of sugar, and if they're insulin resistant, they may also need metformin, but you have to find out whether or not getting rid of sugar will fix that first. So you have to know what you're treating. Treat the pathology, not the number. That's the most important thing in medicine. Treat the disease, not the result, not the number.
My question will be, what do you personally prefer to eat? Which kind of diet and what
Me
is your...
personally?
Yeah.
I am a bacon and eggs fan in the morning, so I actually myself prefer a low carb diet. But it doesn't have to be. I mean, the other things too. And maybe that's why why I've got a high cholesterol. But I've got to be careful, and I know I have to be careful.
Sorry, my English is not good.
Okay.
Ja sam lekar. I samo bih želela da vas pitam da li smatrate da postoji veza između metaboličkog sindroma i porasta steriliteta kod mladih žena i šta će se desiti sa decom koja su u metaboličkom sindromu sve više?
Very good question. Is there a relation between metabolic syndrome and infertility? And what about kids who are born of parents who have metabolic syndrome? And what might happen later on? Two questions. I'll take each one. Metabolic syndrome is insulin resistance. Insulin resistance at the level of the ovary can lead to polycystic ovarian syndrome. What happens is that the LH is high, the FSH is low, the theca cells make androgen, they don't get converted into granulosa cells to estrogen because the insulin is driving the theca cell to make lots of androgen. Until you get the insulin down, the theca cell will continue to do that. And as long as that state is still going on, the patient will be infertile, will not be able to cycle. One of the things they do for people with PCOS is they give Clomid in an attempt to try to get a big spike to get an egg out. We have seen, and there are many studies that show that if you can correct the insulin resistance in patients with PCOS, they can become pregnant. So improving the insulin sensitivity will improve fertility status, and we have the data to support that. Now, so that's the answer to the first question. The second question is, if a mother has metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance during the pregnancy, or even gestational diabetes during the pregnancy, what happens to the baby? And the answer is, well, one of two things can happen to the baby. Both are a problem. The baby can come out small because of placental insufficiency because of the metabolic syndrome. Small for gestational age, SGA, we call it. And these babies learned in utero, before they were even born, that getting food was hard because blood flow through the placenta to the baby was compromised because of their metabolic syndrome. So their cells go into storage mode. They learn early on there are epigenetic changes in various genes on chromosomes, marks, there are epigenetic marks. Peter Gluckman and Becky Simmons and many other people around the world have been looking at these epigenetic marks. And what it basically says to the fetus is, the world is a tough place, it's hard to get energy, and when you see energy, you better store it. And so these babies come out very small. Then the neonatologist overfeeds them because they can't release the baby from the newborn unit until they reach a certain weight, and so they give them NeoCare, at 24 calories per ounce, and so they start gaining weight like crazy, and then they they become massively obese and get metabolic syndrome later on, and I have to take care of them. So I see these patients in my clinic. So that's a problem, and we're trying to educate the neonatologists not to do that. Or the second thing that happens is that the mother, because she was a gestational diabetic, the hyperglycemia will cross the placenta, the baby will be exposed to the higher glucose levels, and their pancreases will make extra insulin to try to clear the glucose so that when the baby is born, the baby has a normal blood sugar, but the baby comes out big. So they're large for gestational age, LGA. And those babies often get neonatal hypoglycemia and sometimes get cardiomyopathy because of the heart muscle hypertrophy and causes problems afterwards. It can be a problem up to 6 weeks. Sometimes we have to give them medicine like diazoxide to suppress their insulin release just to get them out of the hospital. And a lot of these babies will continue to make extra insulin all the way along. We've tested these kids, and their insulin responses to glucose are massive. And so when they eat, straight to fat. And so they become massively obese also, for the exact opposite reason that the small babies got fat. So we see these patients in our clinic all the time, and it is a huge problem. And so what we have to do is we have to get the insulin down. And the thing is that their pancreases don't want the insulin to come down. So we have to work very hard. We have many maneuvers that we can use to try to solve that, including medicine sometimes. But,
Želim prvo u svoje lično ime da vam zahvalim na divnom predavanju. Kad izađemo odavde, presretamo šećer i ugljen hidrate sa vlaknima od minimum, mi smo rešili problem. Međutim, postavit ću vam samo 3 pitanja koje su u istoj kategoriji. Okay. 3 pitanja koje su u istoj kategoriji. Deca sportisti, vrhunski sport i rekreativni sport trećeg roda. Hvala.
right, okay. So everybody wants to know about sports, because the food industry, especially the sugar beverage industry, they make these energy drinks, Rockstar and, Gatorade and what have you. And they say that, this is essential and important for repleting glycogen. So it's necessary for athletes. It's not necessary. You can do it. If you're an athlete, you will deplete your glycogen. There's no argument about that. Everyone agrees that, if you're out playing soccer for 3 hours in the heat, you will deplete your glycogen. And a sucrose or high fructose corn syrup solution, like Gatorade or Powerade, will replete your glycogen faster than a standard beverage. That is true. You will replete it faster, in part because the fructose turns into glucose. And by doing so, it can then go into glycogen. So it's basically coming from 2 different ways. It's coming from glucose, and then the fructose comes into glucose, and you can deplete your glycogen faster. If your glycogen depleted, do you have to do this? The answer is no, you do not have to do this. First of all, your glycogen will be replete by tomorrow morning, so you can do it again if you want to. Just with normal food. You don't have to replete it right then and there. Number 2, you can actually burn ketones better if you don't do that. And if you burn ketones, you will actually improve your performance. So there are a lot of low-carb athletes who specifically do not eat carbohydrate, but protein and fat, and actually improve their performance. I mentioned my nonprofit. Our first donors were triathletes. Okay, a Finnish gentleman by the name of Sami Inkinen, okay, and his wife Meredith Loring. Sami was 38 years old, and he was one of the founders of Nokia. The telephone company. He was an electrical engineer. He founded Nokia, made a huge amount of money, sold, and left Finland and moved to the United States, went to Stanford Business School, used his money, and developed a real estate website called Trulia, which was just bought by Zillow for $3 billion. Okay? Sammy is very rich. Sammy is a triathlete. Sammy is like a Finnish Adonis. Okay? I mean, he exercises constantly. Okay? It's his thing. Okay? 6 hours in the gym. And Sammy got pre-diabetes. How can somebody who exercises 6 hours in the gym get pre-diabetes? And he went to the doctor, and indeed, he had a hemoglobin A1C of 6.3. Pre-diabetes. And he had a glucose tolerance test. Indeed, he had pre-diabetes. He's a triathlete. How does he get pre-diabetes? Turns out he was drinking all of the sports drinks because that's what the food industry told him to do. He ended up seeing a low-carb doctor in at UC Davis named Steve Finney. And Steve said, cut the sports drinks. Sammy did. His pre-diabetes went away, and he decided to go low-carb completely. It took him a month to adapt to low carb, to induce the enzymes to be able to burn ketones instead of carbohydrate. But his physical performance, measured in numerous ways, actually improved. And so he and his wife, who was also a triathlete, decided to prove this to themselves and to the world. And they raised money for us in the process. What they did, they rowed, in a boat with rows and oars, from Monterey, California to Honolulu, 2,700 miles, the two of them, in a rowboat, alone, no support vessel, for 45 days, alone, with no power other than GPS, alone, 45 days in a rowboat, alone with your wife. How would you like that? Okay? Now they had to bring food on the board. So for water, they had a desalinator to turn seawater into regular water because they didn't want to bring water tanks because it would be too heavy. Okay? But they had to bring the food. So they brought 580 kilos of a protein-fat mixture, no carbohydrate. Not one molecule of carbohydrate on that boat. It was called the Fat Chance Row. And that's how we got introduced to them, because my book was called Fat Chance. And so they ended up supporting our nonprofit, and that was how we got started. 45 days of no carbohydrate, rowing 2,700 miles in the Pacific Ocean to Honolulu. And they made it faster than anybody else did by 10 days. Now, how did they do that? Because you don't need carbohydrate to perform sports. That's why. It's a myth. Another myth. It's not necessary. Now, you have to adapt. You have to ketone adapt before you can do that. And it takes about a month. So you need to know that. If you don't want to adapt, then you need carbohydrate to, and sugar to replete your glycogen faster. That's true. But you don't have to do that. And if you get prediabetes, you better not do that. Does that answer your question?
I appreciate if you could tell us the greatest challenge, I think, is when we have a obese patient with a high blood fats, a little bit increased HbA1c, and gout.
And what? Gout.
Gout.
All right. So the question is, why do they have gout?
Yeah.
Well, they increased uric acid. So
And
what
you will advise?
uric acid, as I showed in the first talk, is a breakdown product of fructose 1-phosphate. What happens is the ATP has to donate the phosphate to the fructose to phosphorylate it to get it into the glycolytic pathway. So the ATP becomes ADP, and then there's a scavenger enzyme called AMP deaminase 1 that takes the ADP down to AMP down to an IMP, an acetyl monophosphate, and finally to uric acid. So uric acid is a marker. It is a proxy for sugar consumption. The higher uric acid, the higher your sugar consumption. And of course, uric acid causes gout. Benjamin Franklin knew that when he cut sugar, his gout went away. He wrote a poem about it when he was in 1781 or something like that. So we know that sugar is the driver of gout. Now, meat can also affect it. Alcohol can also affect it, but sugar is the primary driver of gout. And virtually everybody who comes off sugar, their gout gets better. And they email me and tell me that their gout is gone. Now, that will also help their insulin resistance. It will help their blood pressure. It will help all their manifestations of metabolic syndrome. And if you get the insulin down, then your fat cells can give up the stored fat, and it can help with the obesity. This is what we do in our clinic every day. We teach people what real food is, because they don't know what real food is. They've never seen it before. They think processed food is food. They don't understand that processed food is not food. Processed food is dangerous. Processed food is a toxin. And so when we teach them what real food is, and they get on real food, their insulin goes down, they become insulin sensitive, any of their metabolic problems go away, and they lose weight by themselves, without any medicine, without even any exercise. But they want to exercise, because when your insulin is high, you're storing energy. You don't want to exercise. When the insulin goes down, you have it to burn. You want to exercise. And so our kids, when we get their insulin down by fixing their diet, the parents say, oh my God, the kid's outside playing. The kid would sit watching the TV and playing video games before, and now the kid's outside riding his bike because he feels like it. Kind of interesting. The behaviors are because of the biochemistry. The behaviors are the result of the biochemistry. Fix the biochemistry, you fix the behaviors. That's the biochemistry always comes first. I mean, if we have a minute, I'll do the script for you so you understand. Okay, let's take you. Okay, what's your name?
Mine?
Yeah.
Ivana.
Ivana. Okay, let's take Ivana back. She said, okay, she eats 2,000 calories a day. She burns 2,000 calories a day. She feels good. Normal day. Is she going to gain weight, lose weight, or stay the same? She's going to stay the same. She burns what she eats, nothing to store, stay the same. Fine. Okay. Now we do an experiment. I'm going to put an IV in your hand. Tape it down. Long tube. I'm going to follow behind you, Ivana, from the moment you wake up in the morning till the moment you go to bed at night. And all through the day, every time you reach for food, breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, in that IV, that long tube, I'm going to pump you in that IV full of extra insulin that your body didn't want or need. I'm going to over-insulinize you, like we do our type 1 diabetics, to get their blood glucose down. I'm going to give you extra insulin over what you needed. Got it? This is a new Ivana. So she wakes up in the morning, starts out the day, just like before, eating 2,000 calories. Except now, because of the extra insulin I pumped her full of, 500 of those 2,000 calories straight to fat. Like what the government does with your taxes. Gone. Before you had a chance to spend it. In this case, gone, Ivana, before you had a chance to burn it. You are now 500 calories heavier. If you stood on the scale, you would weigh 1/7 of a pound more. And you didn't do anything. I did it. Now, you ate 2,000, but you lost 500 to your fat. How many calories are left to burn? 1,500. But your body wants to burn 2,000 because that's where it feels good. And how many calories you burn and how good you feel are the same thing. They're synonyms. Energy expenditure equals quality of life. Things that make your energy expenditure go up make you feel good, like ephedrine off the market, caffeine, 2 hours, exercise. Things that make your energy expenditure go down make you feel lousy, like hypothyroidism, starvation. So you, Ivana, only have 1,500 calories to burn, but your body wants to 1,500, but your body wants to burn 2,000. So what do we call the state where your body has fewer calories than it wants to burn? It's called, I just told you, starvation. So how do you feel when you're starved? Crappy, tired, slothy, sit on the couch, don't want to do anything, don't want to exercise, maybe play video games, and of course, hungry. So in a world of free access to food, which we all live in, which you live in, Ivana, what are you going to go do? You're going to eat back the 500. So now instead of eating 2,000, now you're eating 2,500. Except, I'm still pumping you full of insulin, 100 of those 500, straight to fat. Now you're 600 calories heavier. You're only up to 1,900 to burn. You still don't feel great. And you keep gaining weight. So you go to a doctor, you go to a nutritionist, you say, Doc, I don't get it. Every time I stand on the scale, I weigh more and I don't feel like myself. And the doctor looks at you and goes, are you kidding me? You're a glutton and a sloth, Ivana. You eat too much and you exercise too little. And guess what? It's true. You are. But it's not because you chose to. It's not because you want to. It's because you have to. It's a biochemical drive that the insulin that I pumped you full of set up. My biochemistry changed your behavior. The behavior is a readout, is the result of the biochemistry. The insulin drives the obesity, not the obesity driving the insulin. The insulin drives the obesity. Get the insulin down, and the obesity will go down. But what made the insulin go up?